Imagine waking up and realizing you've spent years reacting wrong to every female test. Every time she created drama, you tried to solve it. Every time she questioned your feelings, you proved your love. Every time she threatened to leave, you begged her to stay. What's happening is you've been conditioned to be reactive, not proactive. It looks like love, but it's actually emotional submission. This is called polarity inversion. If this pattern continues, you'll lose all the attraction she felt for you. In 25 minutes, I'll show you the 10 patterns that 4 philosophers discovered in female behavior that most men will never identify. They weren't studying relationships. They were studying human nature. But what they found explains everything. Machiavelli observing power games in Italian courts. Foucault analyzing how institutions control individuals. Schopenhauer unraveling the unconscious force behind all choices. Jung mapping the psychological masks that govern human behavior. Each discovered something specific about how women operate differently from men. How they test, how they compete, how they control, how they choose. Patterns that have repeated for centuries but you never learn to recognize. You're about to discover why some men are irresistible while others are disposable. Why some control relationship dynamics while others are controlled by them. Why some men make women work to win them while others work to not lose them. The difference isn't in looks, money, or status. It's in the ability to recognize hidden patterns and respond strategically instead of emotionally. The first pattern begins with something every man has experienced, but few understood what was really happening. She asks if you like her new haircut. You say yes, it looks beautiful. She smiles, thanks you, you continue with your day. You think it was a simple conversation about appearance. You're wrong. What really happened? She tested your perception ability, your attention to details, your willingness to validate her, your sensitivity to changes she considers important. And you responded to the test thinking you were answering the question. This happens dozens of times daily, and you don't notice. When she comments the restaurant is empty, it's not about the restaurant. When she mentions her friend broke up, it's not about the friend. When she asks what you're thinking, it's not innocent curiosity. Each interaction has 2 layers, what she says and what she really wants to know. Most men only respond to the first layer. That's why they fail tests without knowing they were being tested. You interpret literally because you were programmed for direct communication. She communicates indirectly because she was programmed to get information without revealing her true intentions. 2 completely different languages being used in the same conversation. The result? You think you're being helpful, attentive, honest. She thinks you're inattentive, predictable, easy to manipulate. You try to please by answering what she asked. She loses interest because you didn't understand what she really wanted to discover. The consequence is always the same. You become too transparent, too predictable, too safe. And safety to a woman is the opposite of attraction. Men who recognize these hidden layers gain instant strategic advantage, as Machiavelli discovered observing power games in Italian courts. Men who recognize these hidden layers gain instant strategic advantage, and Machiavelli discovered this by observing something that happened daily in Florence palaces, but most people pretended not to see. She'll never attack you directly, never tell you to your face she dislikes your shirt, thinks your friend is stupid, or is considering breaking up with you. That would be rude, aggressive, socially unacceptable. Women were trained from childhood to be polite and gentle, so they developed something much more sophisticated, the art of subtle destruction. Machiavelli observed this in 16th century Italian courts. He saw how noble women eliminated rivals without ever seeming cruel, how they manipulated political situations without leaving fingerprints, how they got what they wanted while maintaining reputations of being sweet and harmless. Lucrezia Borgia was a master at this. Daughter of Pope Alexander VI, she needed to navigate a brutal world while maintaining an image of feminine purity. Machiavelli documented how she influenced crucial political decisions without ever appearing as the true source of power, how she eliminated threats through third parties, how she planted ideas in men, making them believe they were their own ideas. Modern women use exactly the same tactics. They don't say they dislike your ex-girlfriend. They casually comment, "She seemed kind of unstable, right?" They don't criticize your friends directly. They ask, "Why do you think he drinks so much?" They don't attack your dreams. They question, "Is that realistic?" Each phrase is carefully calibrated. They plant seeds of doubt without seeming controlling. They influence your decisions while keeping their hands clean. They make you question things you'd never question alone. Machiavelli called this indirect power, the most effective of all powers because the victim doesn't realize they're being influenced. She thinks she's reaching her own conclusions. Why do they do this? Because it works. Direct competition generates open conflict. Indirect competition generates results without social consequences. They learned it's better to win subtly than lose honestly. The problem is, men often don't realize a game is happening. They think those comments are innocent observations, that those questions are genuine curiosity, that those suggestions are well-intentioned advice. Machiavelli knew whoever doesn't recognize the game always loses the game. But he discovered something even more important: how to use this female need for control against itself. This leads us to what Foucault discovered about how she turns you into a walking prison. People who exercise power through subtle manipulation develop a compulsive need for emotional control. And Michel Foucault discovered exactly how this control works when he studied 18th century prisons. You check your phone before showing it to her. Think twice before going out with friends. Explain yourself for things you shouldn't explain. Feel strange anxiety when she's too quiet, when she takes too long to reply to messages, when her tone of voice changes slightly. Why does this happen? Because she created something Foucault called an emotional panopticon around you. In 1785, Jeremy Bentham designed a revolutionary prison, a central tower surrounded by cells. The guard in the tower could see all prisoners, but prisoners would never know if they were being watched. The result? They behaved as if they were always being monitored even when alone. Foucault studied this design in Discipline and Punish and realized something brilliant. The most effective power isn't one that forces obedience. It's one that makes the person police themselves. When you internalize surveillance, you become your own jailer. Women apply this principle instinctively in relationships. They don't need to control you directly because they taught you to control yourself. How? Through seemingly innocent questions that create lasting anxiety. Who were you thinking about after sex? Why are you quiet today when you're normal? It's fine, you don't need to do anything when she's clearly upset. You seem different without explaining different how. Each question is a small insecurity chip implanted in your mind. You start questioning yourself constantly. Am I being attentive enough? Did I do something wrong? Is she losing interest? Do I need to explain myself? Foucault realized this type of power is more effective than any direct blackmail or threat because you start exercising it over yourself. You live in a state of constant self-surveillance, trying to anticipate what she wants, trying to avoid conflicts that don't exist, trying to prove innocence for crimes you didn't commit. The most dangerous part is, this feels like love, feels like care, feels like genuine interest in the relationship. She just wants to understand our relationship better. But the real effect is you gradually lose emotional autonomy. Foucault documented how institutions use this method to create voluntary submission. Schools, hospitals, prisons apply the same principle. Make the individual constantly monitor themselves to meet external expectations. In relationships, it works the same. You internalize her critical voice. Even when she's not present, you wonder what she'd think of your choices. You self-censor before even acting. You mentally explain yourself for conversations that haven't happened yet. Schopenhauer discovered where this compulsive female need for control comes from when he analyzed the blind force that governs all human decisions. What does she really want when she says she wants something completely different? Why does she choose the wrong guy knowing he's the wrong guy? Why does she sabotage relationships that work perfectly? Arthur Schopenhauer spent decades observing this paradox after a traumatic personal discovery. His own mother, Johanna Schopenhauer, a famous writer in 19th century Germany, had destructive relationships repeatedly. She knew the men she chose weren't good for her. Still, she kept choosing them. Schopenhauer realized there's something more powerful than reason controlling female decisions. Something operating below consciousness, completely ignoring logic. He called this force will. The will, according to Schopenhauer, is a blind, irrational energy that moves all living beings. It has no conscious objective. It doesn't plan the future. It doesn't learn from past mistakes. It simply wants intensely, without rational explanation. In the world as will and representation, He documented how this force is especially intense in women because they carry the evolutionary responsibility of reproduction. The female will doesn't seek happiness, stability, or compatibility. It seeks intensity, dominance, reproductive power. This explains attraction to the guy who treats her badly, loss of interest in the guy who treats her well, creating drama when everything's calm. The will needs turbulence to feel alive. Schopenhauer observed that when a woman says, "I want a caring, attentive man," her will is lying. What the will really wants is an unpredictable man who awakens insecurity and consequently emotional intensity. She consciously chooses the stable accountant and secretly fantasizes about the problematic musician, complains that men don't commit while rejecting men who want to commit, says she wants peace while creating constant conflicts. The contradiction isn't pretending, it's internal war between conscious mind and unconscious will. The mind plans logically, the will chooses emotionally, and the will always wins because it's more primitive, stronger, more persistent. Schopenhauer discovered something disturbing. Trying to satisfy her conscious desires is useless because they're not the real desires. Real desires come from the will, and the will wants to be dominated, not pleased. That's why excessive kindness generates contempt, why constant availability generates boredom, why emotional security kills attraction. You're feeding the conscious mind while the will starves. Most men react by trying to be kinder, more attentive, more predictable. They think if they solve all her problems, she'll be satisfied. Fatal error. Schopenhauer knew satisfying the female will requires the opposite strategy. Jung discovered how this force manifests through psychological masks she doesn't even realize she's using. Why does her personality completely change depending on who's present in the room? With you, she's sweet and submissive. With friends, she's confident and dominant. With the boss, she's professional and reserved. With family, she's rebellious and confrontational. Which is the real one? All of them, and none of them. Carl Jung discovered this the most painful way possible during his relationship with Sabina Spielrein, his patient who became colleague and lover. Sabina presented completely different personalities in different contexts. Jung became obsessed, trying to discover who she really was behind all the masks. It took years for Jung to realize he was asking the wrong question. The issue wasn't discovering her real personality. It was understanding why she needed so many different masks. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, Jung explained that we all develop a persona, a social mask we present to the world. But he discovered women develop multiple personas, much more sophisticated than men, because they need to navigate more complex social situations. The caring girlfriend persona, the supportive friend persona, the obedient daughter persona, the competent professional persona, each with behaviors, values, even slightly different voices. Jung realized this isn't falseness, it's psychological adaptation. Women were evolutionarily programmed to read social environments and adjust behavior to maximize acceptance and minimize conflict. Each persona is a survival tool for specific contexts. The problem arises when you fall in love with one of the masks thinking it's the complete person. You know the perfect girlfriend persona and assume she's always like that. When other personas appear, you get confused, betrayed, disillusioned. She changed. She's not the same person anymore. It was all fake. No, you were simply seeing only one facet of a multi-dimensional personality. Jung discovered something even more disturbing. Women project onto you the animus archetype, the ideal masculine figure that exists in their unconscious. It's not you they're loving. It's the idealized version of masculinity they projected onto you. This explains why she gets disappointed when you don't meet expectations that were never discussed. Why she demands behaviors you never promised to have. Why she gets frustrated when you act like yourself instead of acting like the ideal man she imagined. Projection works both ways. You project onto her your anima, the feminine ideal from your unconscious. This explains why you get disappointed when she's not always sweet, always understanding, always emotionally available. Jung understood that healthy relationships happen when two people can see beyond projections and accept each other's multiple facets. But most relationships fail because people fall in love with projections, not real people. The strategy isn't trying to break her masks or force her to always be the same. It's understanding that multiple personas are a natural part of female psychology. It's learning to recognize which mask is active and respond appropriately. When you stop taking personality changes as personal betrayal and start seeing them as instinctive social navigation, you develop something powerful: immunity to female emotional manipulation. How do you identify an indirect game before falling into it? How do you neutralize subtle manipulation without seeming paranoid? How do you use natural female competitiveness to your advantage instead of being destroyed by it? Machiavelli developed these strategies out of survival necessity. When the Medici returned to power in Florence in 1512, he lost his political position and was tortured for suspected conspiracy. During forced exile, he closely observed how aristocratic women maintained influence even without official power. He realized they followed predictable patterns. When a woman gives a compliment immediately followed by a negative observation, she's strategically planting doubt. Nice shirt, a bit tight, right? It's not about the shirt, it's testing how you react to disguised criticism. Defensive response shows insecurity. Completely ignoring shows you don't pay attention. The Machiavellian strategy: thank for the compliment and completely ignore the criticism as if you didn't hear it. Another pattern Machiavelli observed: when she mentions other men's qualities in your presence, she's activating competition. John is so attentive to his wife. Peter always remembers anniversaries. Carlos is so romantic. She wants you to compete by proving you're better than them. Fatal error: trying to outdo the examples she gave. Correct strategy: praise the guys she mentioned with exaggerated sincerity. Really, John is amazing. You should introduce him to your single friends. This reverses the game because now she realizes the strategy backfired. The third protocol is when she creates drama over insignificant things. She's testing your emotional control and willingness to submit. You forgot to put the toilet seat down. You didn't notice I cut my hair. You didn't greet me properly this morning. Natural masculine reaction is to explain yourself, apologize, promise to do differently. Machiavelli knew this demonstrates weakness. The strategy: agree completely and amplify. You're right. I'm terrible with details. I'll probably forget other things too. This disarms the test because you're not defending yourself or promising impossible changes. The fourth protocol is when she threatens emotional consequences. She's negotiating power. If you don't do this, I'll be very disappointed. People who love me would do this for me. You don't care about me. Machiavelli observed that giving into emotional blackmail always results in more emotional blackmail. The strategy: validate the feeling without accepting responsibility. I understand you'd be disappointed. Unfortunately, I can't do that. Period. No justifications. No negotiation. No guilt. The crucial limit: never use these strategies to hurt or humiliate. Machiavelli distinguished between neutralizing power games and being gratuitously cruel. The goal is maintaining your emotional autonomy, not destroying hers. The sign it's working: she stops testing indirectly and starts communicating directly. But the emotional control Foucault identified requires an even more sophisticated approach. How do you break a prison you don't realize exists? How do you resist emotional control without becoming insensitive? How do you maintain emotional autonomy without destroying intimacy? Michel Foucault developed these strategies studying resistance in asylums, prisons and hospitals in 1960s France. He discovered the most dangerous power isn't one you see coming. It's one that convinces you to police yourself. In relationships, this happens through loaded questions that create lasting anxiety. The first trigger is when she asks impossible questions to answer honestly. Do you love me? Do you think about other women? Am I the most beautiful woman you've ever known? Any direct answer puts you in a trap. Answering yes sounds fake and creates impossible expectation to maintain. Answering no or hesitating creates immediate conflict. The Foucaultian strategy: refuse to participate in the question's premise. What a strange question. Why are you asking that? You return emotional responsibility to her. Force her to explain why she's creating the test instead of you proving innocence for a crime you didn't commit. The second trigger is when she creates an atmosphere of constant judgment through observations about your behavior. You're different today. You seem distant. You're not being affectionate. Foucault called this normalizing examination, a process where the person is constantly evaluated against implicit standards that were never clearly defined. The resistance: demand specificity. Different how exactly? Distant compared to when? What specific affectionate behavior were you expecting? This forces her to articulate vague expectations into concrete demands. Most of the time she can't, because expectations are emotionally based, not logically grounded. The third trigger is when she uses guilt as a control tool. If you loved me, you'd do this. People who care about me do this. I'm disappointed in you. The goal is making you feel responsible for her emotional well-being. Foucault studied how institutions use guilt to create docile subjects, people who control themselves to avoid disapproval. The resistance strategy: separate your feelings from her expectations. I understand you're disappointed. That doesn't change my decision. The fourth trigger is emotional surveillance disguised as care. She monitors your schedules, friendships, online activities, emotional reactions, always with justifications that sound reasonable. I just want to understand you better. Relationships need total transparency. Foucault knew normalized surveillance is more effective than forced surveillance because you stop resisting it. The counter strategy: maintain areas of privacy not because you have something to hide, but on principle of individual autonomy. The essential limit: never use these strategies to avoid genuine intimacy or real responsibility. Foucault distinguished between resisting manipulative control and fleeing healthy emotional connection. The success sign: dramatic decrease in emotional tests because she realizes she can no longer control you through guilt. Schopenhauer's will, when it can't be controlled, needs to be channeled. How do you work with a force that doesn't obey logic? How do you channel irrational energy without being destroyed by it? How do you satisfy the female will without becoming its slave? Arthur Schopenhauer discovered these strategies through decades, observing his own mother, Johanna, repeat self-destructive patterns in relationships. She was a famous writer in Weimar, intelligent and cultured, but consistently chose men who made her suffer. This contradiction obsessed Schopenhauer for years. In Parerga and Paralipomena, Schopenhauer wrote about the need to recognize the will without being dominated by it. He realized trying to completely suppress irrational impulses only made them more destructive. Wisdom lay in redirection, not suppression. When she acts completely irrationally and then tries to justify logically, you're seeing the will in conflict with reason. She decides out of nowhere she wants to end the relationship, or radically changes her opinion about something important, or creates conflict for reasons she can't explain properly. Typical masculine reaction is trying to convince her through reason. Present logical arguments show inconsistencies in her reasoning, appeal to objective facts. Schopenhauer knew this is useless because you're trying to solve an emotional problem with intellectual tools. Schopenhauerian strategy: accept the decision came from the will and work with the will, not against it. I understand. You feel you need this now. Period. No argumentation, no attempt to change through logic. The second trigger is when she seeks drama and emotional intensity destructively, creates unnecessary fights, manufactures crises, turns small problems into big conflicts. The will needs turbulence to feel alive. Schopenhauer observed that trying to calm the storm only prolongs turbulence. The strategy: give the intensity she seeks, but constructively. Instead of entering the fight, create intensity through passion, adventure, new experiences. Oh, you want excitement? Let's do something completely different. Redirect destructive energy to productive channels. The will gets satisfied with intensity, but without destroying the relationship. The third trigger is when she tests your emotional strength through extreme behaviors. Threats to break up, emotional blackmail, provocations to see if you'll give in or explode. Schopenhauerian response: demonstrate you're stronger than her will without trying to control it. If that's what you need to do, I understand. Maintain absolute calm while she goes through emotional storm. The fourth trigger is when she projects blame for her own irrational impulses. You make me feel this way. It's your fault I'm acting like this. If you were different, I wouldn't need to do this. Schopenhauer knew accepting responsibility for another person's irrational impulses is the fastest path to emotional slavery. The strategy: return responsibility without cruelty. You're responsible for your feelings and actions, I'm responsible for mine. The essential limit: never use these principles to be emotionally unavailable or cruel. Schopenhauer distinguished between not being controlled by another person's will and being insensitive to genuine suffering. The success sign. She stops testing your emotional strength because she realizes you can't be manipulated through drama. But Jung's multiple personas create even more complex challenges. How do you avoid becoming prisoner to the unrealistic expectations she projects onto you? How do you maintain your real identity when she wants you to be the ideal man who exists only in her fantasy? How do you navigate between multiple personalities without losing your own? Carl Jung developed these techniques during his 40 years of clinical practice in Zurich. He observed patients constantly projecting archetypal figures onto him: the wise father, the savior, the perfect lover. He learned the hard way that accepting these projections always ended in disillusionment and conflict. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote about the importance of withdrawing projections, the process of returning to people responsibility for their own unrealistic expectations. When she demands behaviors you never promised to have, you're seeing archetypal projection in action. Real men do this. If you loved me, you'd be like this. I thought you were different. She's projecting the animus archetype, the ideal masculine figure from her unconscious. Men instinctively try to fit expectations to maintain the relationship. Jung knew this creates toxic dynamics where you live playing a role instead of being yourself. Jungian strategy. Refuse the role without rejecting the person. I understand you expected that. I never promised to be that person. Establish clear identity boundaries. You're not responsible for meeting fantasies she created about who you should be. Another common manifestation, when her different personas make contradictory demands. The romantic girlfriend wants more attention. The independent woman wants more space. The companion wants stability. The wild woman wants adventure. All simultaneously. Jung realized trying to satisfy all personas simultaneously is impossible and self-destructive. The strategy: recognize which persona is active and respond appropriately to that specific persona without trying to please all at once. I see you're feeling adventurous today, or I notice you need stability now. Validate the active persona without promising you'll always meet that specific need. The third trigger is when she tries to turn you into her therapist, dumps all emotional problems, expects you to solve past traumas, wants you to cure deep insecurities. You become the repository for all unresolved psychological issues. Jung developed clear professional boundaries because he realized romantic relationships where one partner becomes the other's therapist always fail. The strategy: offer emotional support without assuming therapeutic responsibility. This seems important for you to work on. Maybe it would be helpful to talk to a professional about this. You can be empathetic without being her emotional healer. The fourth trigger is when she tests whether you'll maintain your identity under intense emotional pressure. Blackmail, tears, threats, seduction, everything to see if you'll break and give into the roles she wants you to play. Jung called this individuation test, an unconscious process where she checks if you're psychologically mature enough to maintain your own identity even when emotionally pressured. Jungian strategy: remain compassionate but immovable. I see you're suffering. That doesn't change who I am or what I can offer. The crucial limit: never use these principles to avoid genuine intimacy or personal growth. Jung distinguished between maintaining healthy identity and being emotionally unavailable from fear of vulnerability. The sign it's working: she stops trying to mold you into archetypal fantasies and starts relating to who you really are. Integration of all these philosophical insights creates something powerful. How do the four insights work together in practice? Why using only one isolated protocol always fails? How do you integrate Machiavelli, Foucault, Schopenhauer, and Jung into a cohesive system that actually transforms your dynamics with women? The answer lies in a fascinating historical discovery. These four philosophers, even living in different eras, studied each other and developed complementary ideas. Foucault wrote extensively about Machiavelli in The Birth of Biopolitics. Jung cited Schopenhauer as one of his main influences in psychological types. Schopenhauer considered Machiavelli a political genius in his essays. They didn't know they were creating a complete manual for understanding female behavior. But that's exactly what happened. The system works in integrated layers. When she uses indirect power against you, that's Machiavelli in action. When you feel that strange anxiety of having to explain yourself, that's Foucault operating. When she acts completely irrationally, that's Schopenhauer's will. When she changes personality depending on situation, that's Jung manifesting. The fatal error most men make is trying to solve each situation in isolation. They use Machiavellian strategies against Foucaultian emotional tests. Try to apply Schopenhauerian logic against Jungian projections. Result? Total failure, because they're using the wrong tool for the specific problem. Integration works like this. First, you identify which force is operating. Is it subtle manipulation? Use Machiavelli. Is it emotional control? Use Foucault. Is it pure irrationality? Use Schopenhauer. Is it multiple personas? Use Jung. But here's the secret the four philosophers discovered. These forces rarely operate alone. A woman can use Machiavellian indirect power to create Foucaultian emotional control, driven by Schopenhauerian irrational will through different Jungian personas. For example, she casually comments about an ex-boyfriend who knew how to be romantic, Machiavelli, indirect competition, while questioning if you really care about her, Foucault, anxiety creation. Because she's feeling emotionally needy without logical reason, Schopenhauer, irrational will. Expressing this through the dissatisfied girlfriend persona, Jung, situational mask. Integrated response. Recognize the Machiavellian game without competing. Refuse the Foucaultian emotional test. Accept Schopenhauerian irrationality. And validate the active Jungian persona. Interesting you're thinking about him. Seems you've been needing more emotional intensity lately. One response that neutralizes all four elements simultaneously. This is what Machiavelli would call virtù, ability to adapt strategy to specific circumstances. Foucault would call it resistance to power. Schopenhauer would call it detached contemplation. Jung would call it individuation. When you master this integration, something fundamental changes in your identity. You stop being reactive and become strategic. But this transformation goes beyond relationship techniques. What's the difference between who you were at the beginning of this video and who you can become now? Between the man who reacts emotionally to every female test and the man who recognizes patterns behind behaviors? The transformation isn't just about relationship techniques. It's about a fundamental identity change. You stop being someone things happen to and become someone things happen with. The four philosophers lived this transformation in their own skin. Machiavelli, after being tortured and exiled, developed a cold, objective understanding of power that made him one of history's most influential thinkers. Foucault, after traumatic experiences in youth, created intellectual tools to resist institutional manipulation. Schopenhauer, after destructive relationships, developed emotional autonomy that allowed him to live and think freely. Jung, through his own individuation process, learned to navigate between multiple psychological realities without losing his essence. They all made the same discovery. When you stop being controlled by external forces, you develop something very few people possess: real psychological autonomy. The strategic man doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, doesn't explain choices he made consciously, doesn't accept responsibility for problems he didn't create, doesn't compete for female attention, because he understands competition demonstrates neediness. He recognizes indirect games without being offended, resists emotional control without becoming insensitive, accepts others' irrationality without assuming responsibility for it, navigates between different personas without losing his own identity. But the deepest change is internal. The strategic man isn't afraid of solitude because he developed a solid relationship with himself, isn't afraid of conflict because he learned not every problem needs immediate resolution, isn't afraid of rejection because he understands real compatibility is rare and valuable. Women feel this difference instinctively. They stop testing because they realize you can't be manipulated through emotional drama. Stop competing indirectly because you don't enter the game. Stop creating emotional surveillance because you maintain autonomy independent of their approval. Result: the type of female respect that can't be forced or negotiated. It can only be earned through genuine psychological strength. Your consolidation ritual is simple. Next time a woman tries any of these patterns with you, indirect test, emotional control, irrationality, multiple personas, pause 3 seconds before responding. In those 3 seconds, ask yourself, Which force is operating here? How would a strategic man respond? Then respond from a position of autonomy, not reactivity. That 3-second pause will become automatic, and when it becomes automatic, you'll have completely integrated the difference between being controlled by relationship dynamics and consciously controlling them. You won't be the same man who started watching this video. You became someone who understands the real game being played, and applied knowledge is real power. Now you've seen how 4 philosophers discovered the hidden codes of female behavior. Click the video on screen, you'll discover even deeper secrets that will completely transform how you understand human nature. Click now on the video on screen